wanted to talk with you today about the MicroHeli blade grips upgrade and some of the other parts that I got. One of the first things I did was go ahead and get a new main shaft. It's a MicroHeli solid carbon fiber. I decided against the MicroHeli aluminum shaft because I was afraid it was just going to end up bending on my first hit, and there's probably no way you could ever get that straightened out. They also offer a titanium shaft, and I just thought that would end up being too heavy, so I decided to try out the carbon fiber solid main shaft, and so far it seems to have worked out really well, and I'm very happy with that. Now once I got all the parts assembled, I set my plane down and spooled it up, and just as soon as I spooled it up I was like, wow, I could really tell a big difference in the way it sounded. It was just really smooth, it sounded really precise, and it flew really well. Once you put all these pieces together, they really end up being very, very solid, a lot more precise, and just a lot tighter feel in the entire mechanism there. So I can understand why it actually, I think, flies better and is just a lot more precise. Now the first thing I'd like to talk about is the rotor hub itself. Get that zoomed in there. The rotor hub here is in silver, and one of the things that it has are these rotor arms right in here, and they have a little hole that you stick the linkage through, and that is really a great feature because I number one, used to crashing so often, the linkage would pop off quite often. It would just go, popping right off, and I'd lose the little linkage, and or they would snap in half. And I went out and ended up buying 5 packages of these things because I was breaking them and losing them so much. And after getting this new rotor hub, I have never, that's the original linkage that I put on there, I have not broken a single one, and they have popped off, but not completely off. They usually pop off down at the bottom, and they stay on the whole time. So just from saving money alone on the linkage, it was a real good purchase because, again, I crashed so much that I was breaking those things left and right. So that was a real advantage. Now there is one disadvantage you need to be aware of, and that is this little gap where that fits down in there, the linkage. The links don't fit. Get over here, and it's not the fault of MicroHeli, because this particular link did fit in there with no problem. Luckily they never break, so I never had to use any of my other ones. But I tried sticking some of my other ones in there, and I don't think you can see it here, but the thickness of the plastic is actually the wrong size. You can actually see it's flashed up, and that's a term for plastic molding, is flash. And it just means the tool has worn a little bit, and so the plastic itself is wider than that gap. So one of the things that you got to be aware of is you might end up having to sand down your links to get them through that little hole. It's good on MicroHeli, but bad on their plastic molding process. Blades tolerances are just a little loose there. So just keep that in mind. Not a big deal, but something you'll definitely want to be aware of. Now the other thing I found when I installed my blades on my new blade grips here, the grips themselves were just too tight. They were actually just kind of binding the blades themselves, and I've heard a lot of different people online talking about, well, they they should swing easily, they shouldn't swing easily, you know, and I've never really figured out for sure yet, still being a beginner, of how tight that should be. So I've left it a little bit on the tight side, but I did on one of them go ahead and take the blade itself and sand down the surface area just a little bit, cut away some material so that they wouldn't be quite so tight in the grip itself. Now another thing about the blade grips that were a little strange was once I got them all together and fired them up and flew it for the first time, when I got finished I noticed all these little streaks, and you can kind of see them here on the blade itself, and either grease and or solvent came out of the bearings inside of here and just streaked along the blade. Now it was kind of strange. I thought, okay, I'll just wipe it off, but it like etched right into the surface there, so it makes me think it might be a solvent. No big deal, it's not going to affect your flying, I'm sure, but it's just something you might want to be aware of. Maybe you want to spool it up the first time with a set of blades that are old and beat up or something. But I was kind of surprised. Another thing that happened to me was these screws were not staying in. I'd fly them and they would just come loose, and they wouldn't fly out, but they would just be completely loose when I was done flying. And I couldn't tighten them down because it would tighten the blade down so much that it, you know, would not flex properly. What I ended up doing was, at first I decided, well, I'll put some blue Loctite in there, and I tried that, and the blue Loctite ended up not holding. It just they kept coming loose, the screws kept coming out. So then I thought about the red Loctite, but I was a little afraid because of their claims of, you know, it's permanent and it, you know, 450 degrees or pounds of pressure or some sort of specs that, you know, this is permanent. So what I ended up doing for a solution is I put the screws almost all the way in. I come in and I put just a dab of super glue, the gel type super glue, and I put some super glue on it in there, and then I just go ahead and screw down and tighten the screw back down, and I have found that works pretty well. I'm able to lock it down, not tighten it down where the grips are too tight, but the super glue seems to hold just fine, and so that worked out pretty well for me. Okay, one last thing I wanted to show you. It doesn't really have to do with the blade grips or anything, but again, I crash so much. A lot of times my blade, you can see, you know, I just beat the heck out of these things, and every once in a while I'll smack it good and it'll get a hairline crack up here, and it's basically cracked through, and you know, I'm trying to save my blades and use them as long as possible. So what I ended up doing is a kind of a fix. It's not a permanent fix, but what I do, and you can see here I've had 2 cracks in this particular set, but what I've done is I take my soldering gun that has a real pointy tip on it and I just kind of touch it hot, like a little patch spot weld, and I do it on both sides, and that has actually seemed to help keep it from breaking again. This one was spot welded, and this one ended up breaking later. Before I did that, I was, you know, it was actually breaking, you know, chunks out like this back in here when I'd hit it again. So that might be something you want to consider. I highly recommend that blade upgrade and the rotor hub, and I'd consider that solid carbon fiber main shaft too. Overall, the MicroHeli stuff has been a really great system for me, and I'm really happy with its performance.